Just so that we're all sure that we're talking about the same thing when we speak of remembering ourselves, because that's
yes, I wanted to ask that.
A phrase that you and a few others are familiar with from Ouspensky's tradition, but it's the same, although this was not fully understood often in Ouspensky's tradition. But what is really meant by remembering oneself is being aware of being aware. It's self-investigation or self-abidance, or returning attention to its source. So if we visualize awareness as the source of attention, the place from which attention rises, attention goes away from its source towards an object in order to know something other than awareness. And then when its attention is not focused on the object, it falls back to its source. So that what is called self-remembering or self-abidance or self-investigation, or Ramana Maharshi called it sinking the mind into the heart, or in the Christian tradition, the practice of the presence of the God. It is the returning of the attention to its source. That the idea is not that the attention is merged in its source 24/7 and never goes out to the object. It's necessary to be engaged with objects, and objects are not a problem. So when our attention is required by the world, in other words, when there is something for us to engage with or to pay attention to, we should do so. We should allow the attention to go out and engage with that object. Now, what are the circumstances in which attention is, from the spiritual point of view, legitimately engaged in the world? Functional, if it's required for practical purposes, if it's required for investigative purposes, but by which I mean the kind of conversation you and I are having now, and also for celebratory purposes. For instance, if you want to play music together, or go out for dinner together, or in other words, engage in some kind of sharing of love or beauty, then the mind is required. So in all these cases, practical purposes, exploratory purposes and celebratory purposes, there's nothing wrong with the attention going out towards the object, and then when it's finished with the object, it should come naturally back home and rest there until it's required to go out again. What happens in most cases is that when our attention is no longer required by the world, in order to prevent sinking back into its source, it manufactures a kind of filler object with which to busy itself until it is next required by the world. And the majority of what we attend to is this filler object. And the sole purpose of this filler object is to perpetuate the finite mind, the separate self. Because the one thing the finite mind, or attention, doesn't want to do is to sink in its source, because it momentarily dies there, it ceases to exist. So that is why most people, we go towards objects and substances and relationships, but if there's nothing to go towards, if we can't find an object to direct our attention to, we'll just manufacture a daydream, a fantasy, a daydream. And the purpose of these kind of repetitive, useless thoughts is simply to perpetuate the finite mind and the separate self that is at its heart. So I say that so that, to be clear, that there's nothing wrong with the attention going out to objects, being engaged with objects. So yes, I remember Shankaracharya's metaphor, and it's a very nice metaphor, that the moments when attention returns to its home and we abide knowingly as the presence of awareness, these are like punctuations throughout the day. In between those times, our attention goes out to whatever it is, our work, our family, our situation. And when it's no longer required by the situation, the natural the most natural thing to do is to allow the attention to just sink back to its source. And yes, as you quote the Shankaracharya saying, if we become accustomed to abiding or resting the attention in its source between all these activities, then at some point the source of attention, awareness, it's like an undercurrent that runs through. So it's not just moments that punctuate our day. There is this, it's like an undercurrent. Or it's like this presence of peace in the background that sometimes we give our attention specifically to that peace. We rest our attention in that peace. But when our attention needs to go out into the world, the peace remains in the background, kind of pervading the activities of the mind in its engagement with the world. So it's like a child with its mother. To begin with, the infant is looking only towards its mother. It never it gets upset. If ever its mother is not in eyesight, it starts crying. It wants to be together with its mother all the time. But in time, the child begins to grow away and starts to turn in the other direction and go outwards towards the world. But to begin with, the child only goes out for a minute or two, and then immediately it wants to turn back and to know that its mother is there. So it turns back, it checks that its mother is there, and having reconnected with its mother and to felt that love and security again, it goes out again, this time a little bit further into the world, for a little bit longer. And every now and then it just keeps turning back to check that its mother is there in the background. And then as time goes on, the child can go further and further away. So it's a little bit like that. The attention just keeps coming back to its source, to re-establish what we essentially are. And then the attention can go safely out into the world again, because it knows that in the background of experience that there is this peaceful presence of awareness, which is our true identity.
Yes, that really is helpful. It sort of really puts it in context. I hadn't seen it that way. Can I just go further and try to be clearer about the self-remembering? Try to relate it to the situation of the screen and the film. Is this self-remembering that we're speaking of, being aware of being aware, is that a situation where the film is running, you are still identified with the film, but you are aware of the screen, and so you have a certain amount of control, and that there is another stage where the identification is primarily with the screen, and the film is still going on, but that identification with the film is not pronounced. I say this because there is a situation where I feel as though, yes, I've remembered the teaching, I've remembered something. It makes not a scrap of difference. It doesn't suddenly bring light. But if on another occasion, through perhaps discrimination or something, or a meditative moment, I'm talking about an infinitesimal moment, there is an enormous freedom that can come, that can express itself, say, in the form of realizing momentarily that there is no one something happens to, or that everything is passing through me and I'm not passing through all that happens. If the realization is anything like as deep as this, then a big weight falls, and there is real freedom. Whereas this other situation is good; it gives control, but it's not exactly being born again, if you want to use Christ's words.
Yes.
And I feel as though if the other state could be maintained all the time, that certainly would be being born again. You'd be in a different world completely.
Okay, I'd like to just go back to this phrase, self-remembering. If I were to ask you now to remember breakfast this morning, you could do that.
Yes, yes.
And lunch this afternoon,
yes.
You could do that. Now, if I were to ask you now, turn your attention towards the presence of awareness, what do you do with your awareness? What do you do with your attention? In other words, if I were to ask you to remember awareness.
Will you leave it alone?
What I'm getting at is, if I ask you to remember breakfast this morning appears as an image.
Yes.
A subtle object.
Yes.
And because it's an image, you can direct your attention towards it. If I were to say, turn your attention towards that mirror, you direct your attention towards it.
I see,
It's an object. Now, if I say lunch today, lunch appears as another image. You direct your attention towards it. Now, if I say, direct your attention or remember the presence of awareness, you cannot direct your attention there.
You can't.
Because you can only direct your attention to something with objective qualities. And this is something that has been misunderstood in Ouspensky's tradition. The phrase self-remembering does not mean remember yourself in the same way that you remember breakfast. Remembering is not a good word, and it has led to decades of misunderstanding in Ouspensky and Gurdjieff's tradition. I recommend not using the word self-remembering. I occasionally use it, but I only use it to connect with people that I know used to belong to that tradition, to let them know that what was meant by self-remembering is not the remembering, is not an activity of the finite mind. It is not the remembering of an object. It is the resting of attention in its source. Yeah. So the only reason I use that phrase is to connect that tradition with this tradition. So, because, in other words, anything you remember is an activity of the finite mind. The one thing the finite mind cannot know or remember is its origin, because that is not finite. All a finite mind can know is something finite. In other words, the finite mind cannot know or even direct itself towards awareness. So that is why it is said to be a sinking back of the attention, a falling back of the attention, or a resting of the attention in its source, rather than a directing of the attention. So that's important to understand, that what is meant by self-investigation, self-remembering, self-abiding is not something we do with the mind. If anything, it's a wrestling of the mind. And the mind, because awareness is not in any known direction. So, now just going on from there to your comment about the screen, I'd like to give you another metaphor, which, as you know, I like the screen metaphor very much, but there's I think, a more efficient metaphor for your question about self-remembering or self-investigation or self-abidance. Forget for the moment the metaphor of the screen. Take the metaphor of an actor. Let's say an actor called John. And John is playing the part of King Lear. So John has learnt King Lear's lines, and he comes into the theatre. John is happily married at home, but he leaves his home, he comes to the theatre, he puts on King Lear's clothes, and he adopts King Lear's lines. To all intents and purposes, he becomes King Lear. He doesn't cease to be John, but he's put on King Lear, both the thoughts, both physically, emotionally, and mentally. He now feels King Lear's feelings, he thinks King Lear's thoughts, and he wears King Lear's body. And he lives King Lear's life, and he suffers King Lear's life. So John is so immersed in his role as King Lear that when the play comes to an end, he leaves the theatre and he starts walking home, but he's still wearing King Lear's costume, he's still thinking King Lear's thoughts, and he's still feeling King Lear's feelings, so he's miserable. He doesn't realize the play has come to an end. Now, at some stage, he meets various people on the way who all try to help him. He stops. He tries to have therapy on the way to help him with his suffering. He tries all sorts of things. He tries substances. He tries everything to cure his misery. But nothing he tries works. And one day he meets a friend who just sits him down on the bench and says to him, "Take the thought I." He's talking to King Lear. His friend is talking to King Lear. Of course, his friend knows that King Lear is really John. But as a concession, he speaks, as it were, to King Lear. And he says to King Lear, "Take the thought I. Don't worry about your daughters. Don't worry about all the difficulties in your life. Don't worry about your thoughts. Don't go into your feelings. Don't worry about the condition of your body. Just all your life you've been saying I. What does it mean?" And King Lear begins to think, yes, what is I? And he starts to describe to his friend his thoughts. And his friend says, no. You are the one that is aware of your thoughts. Don't pay attention to your thoughts. Go find out who this I is. And then King Lear says, my feelings and my body. And every time the friend says to him, no, go more deeply into the sense of I. And with the help of his friend, his attention, King Lear's attention, is drawn to himself, not his thoughts, not his feelings, not his situation, not his circumstances, to himself. And as his attention goes more and more to himself, a kind of memory begins to wake up in him. I'm not King Lear's thoughts. I'm not King Lear's feelings. I'm not King Lear's bodily circumstances. And his attention keeps going deeper and deeper into his essential sense of himself, just the feeling of being. And without realizing it, as he travels more and more deeply into himself, that all King Lear's superimposed thoughts and feelings gradually fall away. And at some point, this memory, I am John, occurs to him. Now, I am John is not a new self. It's not a new I. The only thing that is common between King Lear and John is I. It is the same I. The I of King Lear is the I of John. So King Lear was practicing self-remembering, self-abiding, taking the thought I and allowing his attention to be drawn deeper and deeper and deeper into what that I essentially is. And as our attention is drawn deeper into ourselves, everything that is extraneous or superfluous to the I leaves it of its own accord. And then at some point there is this realization, I am John. Now, in our case, John is, of course, awareness. Awareness has itself taken the shape of the finite mind and has clothed itself in limited thoughts and feelings. So awareness no longer knows its own being as it truly is. It knows its own being to be limited by the body-mind. Awareness has put on the body-mind in the same way that John put on King Lear. So the process of self-remembering or self-investigation or self-abidance or prayer is taking the thought I. If we think we are a separate self, then the separate self takes the thought I, just the regular I that we think we are. However we find ourselves, we take the thought I and we allow our attention to be drawn deeper and deeper and deeper into what this I essentially is. And as it is drawn deeper into our essential nature, it is gradually divested of all the superimposed limitations, just like John was gradually divested of King Lear. And at some point there is this recognition, I am pure awareness. Pure awareness in the sense that I am awareness that is not mixed with anything other than itself, just naked awareness.
Yes, that is a lovely illustration, Rupert, and it makes a good deal of sense that it works by itself if the fundamental self-remembering, the real self-remembering, is a pointer in that direction which will discard the trimmings, as it were.
Yes, but in whatever condition one finds oneself, if one's in whatever emotional or mental state one finds oneself, whatever physical condition one is in, one is always saying, I feel sad, I feel lonely, I am agitated, I am unhealthy, I am sick, I am, this, that and the other. So if our attention is drawn to the essential nature of this that I am, rather than the qualities that have been added to this that I am, but if we really want to know what is this I that I've been talking about all my life, and you allow the attention to go there, we find all that remains of I is just this pure, aware being. If you go back to an experience in your early childhood, and you think of how it felt to be yourself at that moment. Go back to an experience, go back as far as you can go, everyone, in your memory. It can be 10 years, 20 years, and go to something that you can actually remember. And ask yourself, don't be interested in what you can remember, but be interested in how you felt yourself to be at that moment. What was it like to be me, the one that was aware of my experience at that moment? And now compare that with what it feels like to be me now, the one that is aware of my experience. It's the same. There is no difference. The I that I was then aware of my experience. If you go to the feeling of how it felt to be that, the knower of your experience, that hasn't evolved, it hasn't changed, it hasn't moved, it hasn't grown old. Nothing has happened to it. It hasn't been stained by all the thousands of experiences that have passed through it.
No, I can understand this illustration. Yes, I can. I'll come back on the different eyes on some other time, Rupert, before the end of the week. Just one other thing before I put down the mic. In relation to this sinking back, when you referred to it, I believe, last night or the previous night, and you said you invited us, I believe, to look at if there were any effort in relation to this. Well, what came to mind, what seemed to light up was when you also suggested that we could just allow everything to be, just without any reservation at all, a complete no resistance
Yes.
to anything. And that feels like sinking back into attention, sinking back. Is that
yes,
correct?
It's the beginning of the attention sinking back, because as long as we are resisting something, our attention is engaged with that object. So if we first take the position of no resistance, total allowing, we are disengaging the attention from any object. So all that is necessary then is to allow this free attention, free because it is not attached or directed towards an object, just to gradually sink back into its source. So yes, first of all, stand as this unengaged attention, total allowing of the situation. And then allow the attention to rest in the experience of being aware. So it's resting in and as the experience of being aware. Now, to a mind that has been accustomed to engaging with objects all the time, it may seem like an effort to continually disengage with objects and return to its source. The only reason it feels like an effort is because of our previous habit of being almost constantly engaged with objects. So yes, for the finite mind, what is called self-abiding or prayer or self-remembering seems to be an effort from the point of view of the finite mind. From the point of view of awareness, to simply know its own being as it is requires no effort at all. From its point of view, an effort was in fact apparently needed in order to rise as the finite mind and go outwards towards the object. So from awareness's point of view, if anything at all, it is the relaxation of an effort, not the making of an effort. Whereas from the point of view of the separate self, it seems to be that an effort is required. So that is why I say, if it feels that an effort is required, then make the effort. In time, we will realize, no, actually, it's not a new effort that we have to make. It is rather the cessation of an old effort of which we were previously not aware.
Okay, Rupert, thank you very much. I'll digest this. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Norman.